loans made, and then once the loans are made, if the project isn't working out very well, you can't really shut them down because they're they're enlisting high, powerful government people, and so rather than getting paid off, you actually have to lend them more money to keep them going, because otherwise you have to come out and say, oh, they're default, and you really don't offend people who are powerful by doing that. And also you sort of get yourself in financial trouble by saying, yes, a large part of our portfolio is default, and so you're saying, oh, it's just fine, and we're actually expanding and lending them more money. And so that when government is involved in this capital allocation process, you often get really bad outcomes.
Professor Shih. Sorry.
So, yeah, thank you for your sharing. I have a question for Professor Shih. When you talk about how the 80s data is 50% GPA or something like that, but back to the era, back to the era, anything could happen. It's government control. What kind of, what kind of information do we spread out to the world? I don't understand how you could compare that kind of data to what is right now is scientific and registered by data.
Oh, data back then, was it poor? I mean, sure, it probably wasn't as good as it is now, data-wise. But in the 80s, there was a deliberate policy, actually, to foster these rural private firms, which after 1989 was basically stopped, right? So there's this policy in the early 90s called 抓大放小, which is you grasp the big and let go of the small, which basically meant that the government will stop subsidizing, stop helping in any form small companies, which I guess is a good thing, but then they begin to subsidizing in massive scale large companies. So the government could do that, but the problem with this is that large companies being subsidized are hugely inefficient loss makers. They get all this government subsidies, bank loans, et cetera, et cetera. They do end up doing pretty well because they get all these subsidies, and they crowd out all the vibrant, small industries, which created a lot of jobs in the 80s, right? And so then workers, rural workers, were either forced to farm or to work. Fortunately, the export took off, so then rural workers who previously worked for domestic private firms, which would have been great, are now forced to work for FIEs, foreign investment enterprises, on coastal areas. So that's the sort of the growth model in the 90s, which is, you have FIEs, which is efficient growth, financing the inefficient growth of the state sector. The problem now is that the FIEs are stalled completely. No more employment, no more growth in the FIEs for the next few months, if not longer.
My question was about environmental consumption. Professor Shih, I know you mentioned that there is a current drought and the aquifers are drying up in China. I was just wondering if the current government is doing anything, or the current Chinese government is taking any steps to tackle that issue. And also, Professor Witte, I was wondering if the U.S. had any viable policy options besides just throwing money at China to pressure them, I guess, to promote environmental friendly solutions for development.
Well, just quickly on the drought side, one very water-hungry crop that is big in China is in cotton, which China encouraged partly as a help to the textile industry, which is important for growth. And yeah, the adjustment away from that's going to be a tough problem. About engaging with countries like China in terms of trying to encourage them to not take the cheapest form of, say, energy generation, which is generally burning coal, and going with something else. It's hard to think of what else you would do. I mean, you talk about throwing money. I mean, that's not enough. You have to have some sort of agreement signed, something that's enforceable. I mean, you throw money that you can spend on coal plants, that wouldn't really be helpful. But it's hard to think of what you can do if it's not a concrete transfer of resources. The cheapest way to go about things tends to pollute a lot, and to the extent that we care that's causing harm to us, think it generally has to be a buy-off. And it's also the sort of thing where we're dealing with a very poor country, and to tell them to worry about a rich country's concern, which is climate change, that if it isn't a form of a payoff, then I'm just not sure how you're going to get this agreement.
Yeah, on the water issue, since the Chinese government is, again, building a trillion renminbi canal, which channels water from Western China and Southern China into Northern China, I don't think that's going to solve the problem. The problem is that it's a canal, right? So it runs, right? And so it's a feat of, supposedly a feat of engineering and all that. But on the way, there are a lot of farmlands. So the destination is, of course, Beijing for all of these canals. But the farmlands on the way will want some of that water, even if there is water, right? So then Beijing will actually have to, post guards along the canal to prevent local governments from getting the water. That's very hard to imagine. But the other problem, of course, is that there's a drought in southern China. So what if there's a drought in southern China also? They can spare water to ship to northern China. There's just a huge, the search for food self-sufficiency has produced a huge amount of just inefficiency in agricultural economy in China. And also one of the side effect externalities is water shortage in northern China.
Professor Shih,
Two more questions.
you talked about how the national company was loaning to banks and stuff. How long do you think they can maintain propping up the bank's prices before they run out of whatever? And also, as a sort of secondary question, Professor Witte, you talked about how Secretary Geithner had started out sort of on the wrong foot with China. Do you think Secretary Clinton will make similar mistakes, and how will that sort of end up affecting our relations with China?
Basically, the CIC has plenty of money. They can just renationalize all four banks, or all the state banks that have been listed. It would cost them maybe 100 billion, less than 100 billion. So they can totally do that. In fact, they might just do it.
I think that Secretary Clinton's probably a much shrewder operator than Geithner. He's just a PhD in economics or something. Those guys are clods. They can't even pay their taxes, so I think she'll be much smarter.
The U.S. government has recently passed the economy stimulus plan, and among the many clauses, there was one that says purchase U.S. products, and it was widely punished by the Chinese and European governments. Meanwhile, Chinese government says that it would never advocate such a policy. My first question is for Professor Shih. Do you think that Chinese government will keep its words? And do you think that these words is in contrast to its expanding local domestic demands policy? And my second question is for Professor Witte. Do you think that the U.S. will enter a self-protective trading policy?
This push for sort of U.S. infrastructure or the like, with a favoritism toward American-produced steel and things like that, it's not completely crazy, but it does seem like the game isn't worth the candle, as it were.